Okay, good afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining us. We're back at our usual time, Mondays, 12:15. So thank you for that. Our goal for today's class, we're going to explore chapter 12 in the book of Judges, in the book of Shofetim. Chapter 12 is a short chapter which really focuses mostly on the legacy of Yiftah, sort of the last episode that happens in Yiftah's leadership. We'll take a look at his end, and then a few of the judges who follow him, which follow in very rapid succession. The text gives us very little information about them, and we're sort of going to put a bow on Yiftah and his episode and sort of this stage of the leadership of the Jewish people and where they stand before we move into really who is the last of the major judges in our book, and that is the judge of Shimshon. His narrative is going to span several chapters from 13 all the way through 16. We're going to focus on Shimshon. That's going to take us several classes to do. Shimshon's narrative is both fascinating and has a lot to learn from, but we have to kind of set the stage for where the Jewish people are, where the nation is at, and where we've deteriorated to really understand and contextualize Shimshon's narrative. So like I said, again, today's goal is going to be completing chapter 12, putting a bow on Yiftah's leadership and giving us a context of where the Jewish people stand before we enter into Shimshon's narrative. If there's time, we may just enter the Shimshon narrative briefly, just touch on some of the Pisukim, maybe even read chapter 13 just to get a sense of the text, and then leave our analysis and deeper looking into for future classes. So let's see where the time takes us. Let's see what we have, and we'll play it from there. This is part of the reason why I love studying a book in succession, because we know we're going to go from class to class, from shiur to shiur, and we can pick up and kind of end off in the middle of something and have a commercial break and then pick up the next week. So let's begin. I'm showing you the Pisukim of Shofetim chapter 12 up here on our screen. We've constantly talked about how the book of Shofetim is deteriorating in the spiritual status of the Jewish people, as evident from the spiritual status of their leaders. And in this chapter, we're going to continue to push that envelope. Just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, it continues to deteriorate more and more. And so I have to be careful, because my audience is going to stop coming back. They're going to be like, the book of Shofetim is just too depressing to kind of continue with. But you have to really push through these narratives and learn the lessons of them, even though they're hard to stomach, so that you could really appreciate what we're going to go through as we continue through Jewish history and eventually reach the kings of Shaul and David. And you don't really appreciate where they come into play until you see the chaos that they was built from. So it's tough to read, but sometimes you got to learn the tough lessons from some of the tough chapters. So let's read it together. Shofetim, Perek Yud Bet, chapter 12. Verse 1, Pasuk Aleph. Vayitzaek ish Ephraim vayavor tzafona. The men of Ephraim came across the Jordan to Tzafon. Vayomeru Yiftah, and they confront Yiftah, and they say to him a claim that we've heard before. Madua avarta lehilachem bivnei Amon. Why did you go to fight against the Ammonites? Velanu lo karata lalechet imach, and you didn't call us to fight against you, to fight with you against them. Betcha nisrof alecha ba'esh. We are going to burn your house down. Sounds like something the big bad wolf says. Vayomer Yiftah alehem. Yiftah says to them, Ish riv hayiti ani ve'ami uvnei Amon me'od. I and my people were in a bitter conflict with the people of Ammon. Va'eza'ak etchem. And I summoned you, I called to you, I cried to you. Velo hosha'atem oti miyadam. But you did not hear my calls. You didn't come to my aid to save me. Verse 3. Va'ere'eh ki encha moshia. So I saw that when you were not there to help me, to come to my aid, va'asima nafshi bechapi. So I put my life in my own hands. I said, I'll do it myself. Va'evera el bnei Ammon. And I will go myself to attack the Ammonites. Vayitenem Adonai biyadi, and God placed them in my hands. So he acknowledges God's assistance here. Velama alitem elai hayom hazeh lehilachem bi. So why have you come now here to fight against me? What claim do you have? How could you complain or antagonize me over something that I gave you the opportunity to do and you chose not to? And so I had no choice. What recourse did I have? I had to take my life in my own hands, and I did what needed to be done. So who are you to come and to complain? Verse 4, when we think that this confrontation is over, it spirals out of control. Pasuk Dalet. Vayikpotz Yiftah et kol anshe Gilad. Yiftah gathers all of his men from the Gilad region. That's on the eastern side of the Jordan River towards the north. Vayilachem et Ephraim. And they fight against the Ephraimites who live in Eretz Yisrael. We have our first experience of civil war. And you just feel that pit in your stomach. Oh my goodness. We've had confrontations before between tribes, between members of Am Yisrael. We've had near misses of civil war. Go all the way back to the book of Yehoshua, when Reuven, Gad, and Chatzi Menashe built the tower that was at one moment misconstrued as being a cessation of these tribes from the nation of Israel. And before a civil war was able to break out, Yehoshua dispatched Pinchas and several others to talk to them and to calm the situation, and we avoid civil war. We've had this situation with the people of Ephraim antagonizing a leader in Gideon, who when he fought against Midian, also was met with resistance from Ephraim. Why didn't you call us until the end of the battle? And Gideon also averted disaster by stroking the ego of Ephraim, by giving in to them, by placating them. And as a result, he avoided civil war. So we've had some close calls before, but we've avoided it. And eventually we've gotten to a point where you get to strike one, strike two, and finally strike three, and you're out. And this third time, we're not so lucky. We have our first experience of civil war amongst the Jewish people, and it's under none other than Yiftah's rule. Yiftah and his men of Gilad attack the people of Ephraim. Vayaku anshe Gilad et Ephraim. The people of Gilad, Yiftah's men, are successful in destroying the Ephraimites. Ki ameru pelite Ephraim atem. For they had said, you Giladites are for nothing but fugitives from Ephraim. It could be here what this means is that Ephraim had a way of antagonizing the men of Gilad. Remember, the men of Gilad were from the tribe of Menashe. Menashe is the brother tribe of Ephraim and are typically viewed as the inferior tribe. Go back to Gideon, who was from Menashe. He was also looked down upon by the people of Ephraim. And like I said before, he placated them. Yiftah, however, is a much more egotistical leader. He is somebody who has been shunned before. He's been thrown out of his house before. He's somebody who has been tormented as not being a legitimate person, and not legitimate lineage. So Yiftah has a lot of baggage over here. And after finally agreeing to be the leader and being successful, he is not prepared to tolerate this type of insurrection from the people of Ephraim. His ego gets the best of him. Don't forget, Yiftah spent time in Eretz Tov with people who were rekim, people who were empty, who did not have a high moral compass. So Yiftah's background is not one of a typical Jewish leader, of somebody who is humble, someone who will take the high road, someone who will try to avert disaster. No, Yiftah is going to hold his ground. He's going to, stand on ceremony and hold on to his honor. And if it means war, then so be it. And he's successful. And he destroys Ephraim. The people of Ephraim said about Gilad, you're just the remnants, the fugitives of our tribe. You're nothing. Gilad betoch Ephraim betoch Menashe. Being like in Menashe is like being in Ephraim, right? Menashe is our inferior tribe. And so Yiftah exercises those demons over here and shows his strength over the people of Ephraim. He takes his vengeance against them. Verse 5. Vayilkod Gilad et ma'berot hayarden Ephraim. Gilad, the people of Menashe, of Yiftah, They hold the fords of the Jordan against the people of Ephraim. And when any fugitive from Ephraim said, let me cross, right? So the people of Ephraim who wanted to cross back into the land of Israel. In other words, Yiftah wasn't enough that he just drove back the people of Ephraim. Because remember, Yiftah and his men are on the eastern side of the Jordan. Ephraim lives on the western side of the Jordan. So you would expect that if Yiftah and the people are driving them back, that they drive them over the Jordan and they get away. What did Yiftah do? He was vindictive. He went around, he circled them and held the fords of the Yarden so that the Ephraim tribes could not cross, could not get back home. They surrounded them. They ambushed them. And the irony is that the people of Ephraim used to say to Menashe that, Menashe, you're just the fugitives of Ephraim. The people of Gilad are the fugitives of Ephraim. And now in an ironic twist, in a midah keneged midah, vindictive way of Yiftah getting back at them, anybody who was pilite Ephraim, anybody who was a fugitive of Ephraim, trying to run back home, said Yiftah, you're not going to go anywhere. You antagonized us, we're going to kill you. So the people of Gilad would question them at the border and say to them, are you part of the tribe of Ephraim? And they would try to lie and get out of it, say, no, we're not from that tribe, right? Remember, these are tribes that lived in close quarters. They can maybe get away with it. But they had a test. So the people who were at the border, not letting people from Ephraim get out, they said to them, Emorna shibolet, say the word shibolet. Vayomer, and he would say, sibolet. Apparently, the pasuk says, "V'lo yachin ledaber ken," because they were unable to pronounce it correctly. Apparently, we have different, accents, right? Or ways of pronunciation, different dialects amongst the tribes. So this goes to show you how divided the Jewish people are. They're so divided that they no longer pronounce the words the same, right? This, is a big deal for us today, right? Think about what we have today with Sephardic pronunciation, Ashkenazic pronunciation, Hasidic pronunciation. What do those pronunciations represent? They represent our exile. They represent our divisiveness. Now, it's true, we have a culture unto ourselves, and there is a certain beauty in the fact that we have different sects of Jews over the course of thousands of years who have been in exile, who have developed their own customs, their own pronunciations. We still share more in common than we don't, but we have our own cultural aspects and our own way of speaking. That's a product of exile. So it's one that is beautiful and that we try to embrace, given the fact that we've had exile for so long, but it's not ideal. It's not ideal to have different tribes in the Jewish people speaking differently, reading differently. But the divisiveness amongst the Jewish people over the course of many centuries that we've been going through the book of Shofetim now has led tribes to be isolated and to develop their own ways of speaking, their own dialects, their own forms of pronunciation. And the people of Gilad, the men of Yiftah, actually capitalize on that in that they can tell the difference between someone who's from the tribe of Menashe and someone who's from the tribe of Ephraim. Even though these are brother tribes that live right next to each other, just over the Jordan River, they have developed such a divisiveness as to have two different dialects. And therefore, when they questioned the Ephraimites running away at the border and said, say the word shibolet, and they couldn't pronounce it, what would happen? Vayohazuato, they would seize such people. I'm continuing in verse 6. Vayishhatu, and they would slaughter these people, el ma'berot hayarden, by the fords of the Jordan. Vayipol ba'etahim Ephraim, and it fell from the tribe of Ephraim on that day, arba'im ushnaim aleph, 42,000 people die from the tribe of Ephraim. And that is a staggering, staggering number. That our first civil war should produce more casualties, more deaths, more murders, really, from one tribe to another, from the tribe of Ephraim, than we've had in the entire course of the book of Shofetim. As far as our death toll is concerned, we don't even have what the other enemies have done to us. We don't have numbers like 42,000 deaths when we think about how the other enemies oppressed us. Our enemies have not killed us that much as we have killed ourselves. 42,000 is more than any plague Hashem gave to the Jewish people in the desert for any of their sins. It's more than any battle that the Jewish people waged against any enemy. I mean, this is a staggering idea, but it's not one that we should be surprised by because we know how this works. The Jewish people are our own worst enemy. When other enemies come to attack us, it's not as brutal as when we attack each other. And other enemies don't have the power to hurt us the way we have the power to hurt ourselves. And that's an unfortunate lesson, one that we learn here the hard way. But when we get out of control, when feelings of arrogance and pride and vengeance consume us and overtake us, this is the kind of tragedy and travesty that can happen. And it all happens under the watch of Yiftah. And that's the last pasuk that we read here of Yiftah. Vayishpot Yiftah et Yisrael 6 shanim. Yiftah judges the Jewish people for a mere 6 years. And this is clearly the lowest amount of time, the shortest amount of time that we've seen. Every other judge has done 40 years, 30 years, somewhere upwards of that time period. Yiftah only judges and leads the people for 6 years. And rightfully so. He is his legacy, despite the fact that Yiftah comes to the rescue of the Jewish people. And he seems to be someone who is in tune with God. He makes a vow to God. He connects with God. He gives credit to God. So we can't take that away from him. We have to acknowledge Yiftah's position at that. And anybody who could be successful as being the messenger of Hashem must be somebody who was chosen by God to have that kind of success. So we cannot ignore that. But the text seems to be very clear. When you think about the vow that Yiftah made and how we explained it last week, and even if you want to take a more conservative approach of the Hachamim, that he didn't end up killing his daughter, but clearly this is not looked at as a positive thing. God did not answer Yiftah's prayers and his vow in a fitting way that would lead us to a happy ending. Yiftah then, and it's possible this story happened before his daughter, but Yiftah then has the first civil war, kills 42,000 of his brother tribe in Ephraim. We don't even know how many of his own men perhaps died in the course of the battle as well. And he rules for just 6 years. Vayamot Yiftah ha-Giladi vayikaver be'arei ha-Gilad. And Yiftah dies and he is buried in the cities of Gilad. We are certainly left with a feeling of, again, what could have been? What redemption could we have had? And how much worse this continues to get. Every leader and every narrative and every story leaves us wanting more and yearning for more than the story before it. So we started with some great judges. We then transitioned into some okay judges, some judges who mostly were overwhelmingly good, but had some issues. And now we're starting to get more and more to the opposite side of the spectrum. We're having murder. We're having bases of idolatry in our leaders. And the situation is slowly but surely getting out of hand. And it's only going to continue that way as we get into a new enemy, that's the Philistines, in next chapter, and handle the situation with Shimshon. The book of Judges is going to continue to deteriorate more and more from this point on. But we've already seen the deterioration evolve, and it's only going to continue to go from that spot as well. And so this is the way we look at Yiftah towards the end. Before I take questions or comments, I want to just show you a quick midrash that our rabbis point out about Yiftah on this last pasuk, in pasuk 7, that he was buried in the towns of Gilad, which is a brutal midrash, but one that I think sends a very powerful message. I will toggle over here to this source sheet that I have. Actually, I guess before I read the midrash, I should open it up if anybody has any questions or comments so that I don't lose anybody here. Anything to add?
I do, Rabbi.
Go ahead, Esther.
So I find it very interesting that though he had the shortest term and reign as a judge, he got the most print.
What do you mean?
So he has like 2.5 chapters about him. And then we read in the beginning about Tola and Yair, they ruled for 23 years, 22 years, and they got like one sentence, two sentences. He did so much damage, I guess, in my opinion, which is so sad. In such a short time, it's amazing that he got so much, of his story told.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And hold that thought for a minute, because there's going to be more to support what you're saying over here when we take a look at the three judges mentioned right after Yiftah, who are also going to get one or two sentences, and we'll see what the rabbis say about one of them. But I think that the answer to your point is that just goes to show you what the point of the book is. What is the author's goal? Shemuel HaNavi, remember, don't forget who wrote this book. Shemuel HaNavi, who will eventually crown Shaul and after that David as the king. He's the author of our book. So what is he trying to record for us? What does he want the reader to know? It seems as though Shemuel is less focused on the positive reigns and the good leaders as he is in being able to trace the downward spiral and evolution of the people through their leaders. That is what Shemuel is cognizant of. And he wants to trace that history for you so that when we get into our next book, and again, Tanakh is all interconnected. So while we're studying chapter by chapter, we also have to look at the broader picture of things. When we get into our next book, which is the book of Shemuel, which is the same author as the book that we have in front of us, we'll understand what the author wants from us. He wants to show you, why is it that we needed a king? Why is it that it was so dire to get to the point of Shaul and David? Why did we need all of this? Because of how quickly the nation deteriorated through all of this instability of leadership, this divisiveness amongst the tribes. We can't lose sight of that. And so you're right. The fact that we would probably, if we were writing the book and we wanted to tell the glory days of the Jewish people, we'd try to, cover up some of Yiftah or not give him so much airtime and spend more time on Otniel ben Kenaz and Devorah and Barak and all of these great heroes and heroines. But that's not the point of the book as far as the author Shemuel is concerned. He wants to show us the deterioration and the spiral and the chaos that is ensuing as a result of this lack of leadership and having these bad leaders who can't keep things together, to show you where Jewish history is going to lead with the kings. And that to me, that point that you brought out is really the key to understanding the progression of this book and the one that is to follow. Yeah. So that's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up. Take a look at how our rabbis beautifully articulate, I think, their final thought about Yiftah and what they believe is the legacy of Yiftah. This is a midrash that comes from Bereshit Rabbah, chapter 60, number 3. And it's the continuation of the midrash that we read last week about the people who requested things from God in an unfit way. If you recall last week, we mentioned how there were several people who made requests or left themselves open to the fact that somebody unworthy could have fulfilled their vow or their words. And in all of those examples, God made it that someone proper did the deed and did the act, with the exception of Yiftah. So for example, we said that Eliezer, the servant of Abraham, said, whichever girl should give me the water in this way will be the wife for Yitzhak. He left himself open to the possibility that a girl could have a one-time luck of the day and do something, and she may not have been the proper wife for Yitzhak. It could have been someone who was physically, mentally, or emotionally unfit for Yitzhak. But Hashem obviously gave us Rivka, and that's the divine intervention in providence, and it all worked out. Shaul, the same thing. He said, whoever kills Goliath will get my daughter. And of course, God sent him David. So even though some of these great figures in Tanakh weren't careful about what they had said, and that was a lesson that we said we had to learn about the importance of speech and stability in speech, they were answered properly because that was divine destiny. Yiftah, on the other hand, was not answered properly. In the conclusion of that midrash, we find a fascinating idea mentioned by the rabbis. I'll read and translate this midrash for you in front of us. Yiftah. Yiftah asked in an unfit way because he said, whatever comes out of the doors of my home, I will give it as a sacrifice, as a burnt offering to God. What if it was a donkey or a dog or a cat, an impure animal? What was he going to do then? He was going to bring it as a burnt offering. It's prohibited. You're not allowed to do that. So he didn't even think about the possibility for an unkosher animal coming out of his house and offering that as a sacrifice. Clearly, he thought it was going to be an animal. He didn't even consider the possibility of an unkosher animal. And yet, here, God answered him in an unfit way, in the way that he would not have wanted to be answered. Hadahu dichtiv, that's what the pasuk says. Vayavo Yiftah v'hinei bito yotzet likrato. Yiftah returns, and his daughter comes out to greet him. Rabbi Yochanan v'Resh Lakish. Now, the rabbis have a debate over here. Why is it that Yiftah had to fulfill this vow? Rabbi Yochanan says, Hekdesh tamim haya hayav. At the very least, Yiftah needed to redeem with money. In other words, he didn't need to give his daughter as a sacrifice, but he needed to take the monetary value of what his daughter was worth. We won't get into how he would evaluate that, maybe according to the laws of the Torah. They have a chapter called Arachin, of evaluating a person's net worth. We'll leave that on the side, but he would have had to have taken some value of money as a replacement for his daughter. Resh Lakish Amar, Resh Lakish says he didn't even need to do that. Afilu hekdesh damim lo haya hayav. He didn't even need to give a monetary replacement for his daughter. Ditnan, for the Mishnah says, Amar al behemat teme'ah ve'al ba'alat mum hare elu ola. If a person looks at an unkosher animal or an animal which has a blemish and is not fit for a sacrifice and says, this is a burnt offering, lo amar klum, he didn't say anything. You cannot sanctify something which cannot be offered as a sacrifice. Its holiness does not attach itself in such a situation. So Resh Lakish is saying, Yiftah didn't even need to give anything instead of his daughter. He could have easily gotten out of this entire thing. He didn't even have to give the monetary value of his daughter because the vow itself doesn't take hold. It doesn't sanctify something which cannot be offered as a korban, as a sacrifice. Amar hare elu leola, if he would have said this is for a burnt offering, yimachru, then you would have to sell it v'yavi b'dmehem ola and use the money for a replacement to buy some kind of other animal. But what the rabbis here are pointing to is Yiftah wasn't even required to bring his daughter as a sacrifice. He could have gotten out of it. What did he need to do? He did need not to bring a monetary value and a monetary replacement. He did need to annul the vow. It says the rabbis, wasn't Pinchas around at that time who could have annulled his vow? Ela Pinchas Amar, Pinchas and Yiftah had a standoff. Pinchas said, Hu tzarich li, he needs me. Va'ani elech etzlo, and I should go to him? Why should I go to Yiftah? Yiftah needs me to get him out of the vow. He should come to me. So Pinchas held his ground. He stood on ceremony. The Yiftah Amar, Yiftah had the opposite approach. He said, Ani rosh kitzine Yisrael. I'm the head of the Jewish people. I just won a major war against the people of Ammon. Va'ani holech etzel Pinchas. I should go to Pinchas. Why should I go to Pinchas? He should come to me. So each of them stood their ground. They were prideful. They held their positions, and neither went to the other. Ben den leden, between the time that each of them held their ground, avda hana'arahahi, the daughter died, and she was lost. The tragedy is the egos of these two men got in the way of what needed to be done, what could have saved a life of the Jewish people. And isn't that such a fitting representation of what goes on a macro scale in the following chapter? This is a micro version of Yiftah having a standoff with Pinchas, which brings about the loss of his daughter. That's a micro level. On a macro level, Yiftah has a standoff with the people of Ephraim, leads to the murder and destruction of 42,000 people because he cannot bring himself to hold back his ego and try to make peace with the people of Ephraim the way somebody like Gideon did. The divisiveness in the Jewish people is at an all-time high to the point of civil war. Now, the rabbis say this deed did not go unpunished. I'll read to you the end of the Midrash. Ushnehem ne'enshu b'dameha shel na'ara. both Pinhas and Yiftah, and our focus is going to be on Yiftah for now, were punished by the blood of his daughter. Yiftah met b'neshilat evarim. Yiftah suffered a particularly gruesome and painful death, according to the rabbis. His limbs fell off of his body one at a time. He must have suffered from some kind of disease or illness which spread an infection or something of that nature across his body, and slowly but surely his limbs deteriorated and fell off one at a time. A particularly gruesome and painful way to die. Bechol makom shehaya holech bo, everywhere Yiftah would go, haya ever nishol hemenu, a particular limb would fall off. V'hayu kovrim oto sham, and they would bury that limb in that place. Hadahu dichtiv, this is what the pasuk means that we just read in our chapter. Vayamot Yiftah vayikaver be'ared Gilad. Yiftah died and was buried in the cities, plural, of Gilad. How are you buried in multiple cities? Say the rabbis, Be'ir Gilad lo ne'emad. It doesn't say he was buried in the city, singular, of Gilad, ela be'are Gilad. He was buried in the cities of Gilad, meaning his body decomposed one piece at a time and was buried all over the place. Yiftah did not even merit the ability to be buried whole, which is such a basic kavod, the basic honor that we afford to everybody, that they should be buried as a whole individual and they should have that honor. Our rabbis say that Yiftah lost his limbs one by one and was buried in a scattered way throughout the cities of Gilad. This is his end. Just on face value, it's gruesome. It's clearly a punishment. Our rabbis are clearly saying what Yiftah's demise was as a result of his pride that caused the death of his daughter, but maybe even more so the death of 42,000 members of the Jewish people, albeit from another tribe. But there's a certain irony here, a certain midah keneged midah, measure for measure in Yiftah's death. Perhaps what the rabbis are telling us, whether it's true that he concocted this, that he had this particular illness or not, what is the real symbolism here? What is the real depth of the death of Yiftah? I'll leave it open for just a moment. Think outside the box for a minute what the rabbis saw here to describe his death in this way.
I think maybe part of it is that he allowed the Jews to stay divided. So therefore his body was divided. It's kind of like a symbolism like that.
Exactly. 100%. Couldn't have said it any better. Yeah. The rabbis are telling you what Yiftah left behind. He left behind, like his own body, a divided people, a people who could not reconcile together, a people who were at odds, at war with each other, people who could bring each other to kill their own brothers. That is what Yiftah left us. His ego is what left us that. And the egos of all of the different tribes doing their own thing. Ish hayashar be'enav ta'aseh, that phrase that keeps repeating itself all throughout the beginning and end of our book. Everybody doing their own thing, everybody on their own pathway, everybody on their own agenda, right, is what left the Jewish people divided, hating on each other, and it's only going to get worse from this point, and it's because of the leadership or the lack thereof, and what the leadership had given over to the people that caused them to deteriorate into this way. And even Pinhas, who is largely an amazing figure in Torah for the Jewish people, he lived a long life. He goes all the way back to the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. Even he is enveloped into this toxic type of environment and feeling amongst the Jewish people, to the point where the rabbis conclude by saying, Pinhas nitla mimenu ruach hakodesh, his divine providence, his divine inspiration was removed from him because of this standoff that he had with Yiftah. And so this is the end, this pit in the stomach that we have for the conclusion of the Yiftah narrative. And it helps us to understand the state of the union or the lack of union of the Jewish people. We are a nation divided, torn apart, like our leaders, limb from limb. We're scattered all over the place. We are not together. We've had our first experience of civil war. And this is the context which these next few judges are going to inherit, and unfortunately unable to bring that feeling back together, is how the rest of the book of Shoftim will play out. Any questions or thoughts or things to add about the end of Yiftah's rule? We'll close out by reading some of these short Pesukim and mentioning one important point here as we conclude chapter 12 before heading into Shimshon's narratives. Verse 8 to the end of the chapter to 15 talks about three short prophetic leadership careers. Let's read in verse 8. Excuse me, Pasuk Hayat. Vayishpot acharav et Yisrael Ivtzan mi Bet Lahem. Judging after Yiftah was a man by the name of Ivtzan, who came from the city of Bethlehem. Vayhilo sheloshim banim ushloshim banot. He had 30 sons and 30 daughters. Shilah hachutza. So he had 30 sons, and he also had 30 daughters. Those 30 daughters he sent off to get married to men from other tribes. Ushloshim banot hevi lebanav min hachutz. And he brought 30 women, 30 girls, to marry off his 30 sons. So he's clearly producing many families amongst Am Yisrael. Vayishpot et Yisrael sheva shanim. And he serves the Jewish people and judges them for 7 years. Vayamot Ivtzan dies, vayikaver bebetlahem, and he's buried in the city of Bethlehem. I'm just going to read the next two quickly, and I'm going to return to Ivtzan in a moment. Verse 11, Vayishpot acharav et Yisrael Elon hazevuloni. The next judge was a man by the name of Elon, who was from the tribe of Zevulun. Vayishpot et Yisrael eser shanim, and he judges the people for 10 years. Vayamot Elon hazevuloni, and he passes away. Vayikaver be'ayalon be'eretz Zevulun, and he's buried in a place called Ayalon in the land of Zevulun, where his tribe is. Again, very terse, very few details, just his name, where he was from, how long he ruled, and where he's buried. Verse 13, a similar type of narrative. Vayishpot acharav et Yisrael Avdon ben Hillel hapir'atoni. The next judge of the Jewish people was a man by the name of Avdon, the son of Hillel, who was from Pir'aton, is the name of the city. We'll see in a moment. This is also from up north in the Jewish in the land of Israel. Vayhilo arba'im banim ushloshim bene banim. He too had a very large family, 40 sons, 30 grandsons. Rochvim al shiv'im ayarim, who rode on 70 donkeys. Vayishpot et Yisrael shemone shanim, and he judged the Jewish people for 8 years. These are very short stints. We're starting to see the length of judges' stints, starting with Yiftah, getting into the single digits, right? 6, 7, 10 is double digits, but right there, 8 now. We've seen similar language like this before when it came to, I believe it was Tola, right after Gidon, who had 30 sons on 30 donkeys in 30 cities. That Adak over there explained it was about prominence, and it probably means something similar over here. Verse 15 to conclude chapter 12, Vayamot Avdon ben Hillel hapir'atoni. This judge Avdon ben Hillel dies. Vayikaver bepir'aton. He's buried in his hometown. Be'eretz Ephraim, in the land of Ephraim. So he's from that tribe. Behar ha'amaleki, on the hills of the nation of Amalek. And that's an ominous way to kind of end the chapter, a mention of the people of Amalek, which always kind of hovers and looms over the head of the Jewish people, ready to attack. That philosophy, that ideology, always lurking in the background when we're at our weakest as far as Torah and morality and observance of our relationship with God. Amalek always stands somewhere in the shadows, ready to attack, even if just by mention, it's always somewhere there. Notice how all of these judges, they all judge for a short amount of time. They're all buried in their hometown and in their tribe. Again, similar to what we've seen throughout the book of Judges, all the judges are localized to their people, to what they're going to judge, not very widely accepted amongst all of the Jewish people. To conclude our study for today, I just want to return back to verse 8 through 10 to the judge of Ivtzan. Now, if you look at all three of these judges, one argument could be made. One of them we know is from Zevulun. The other we know is from Ephraim. And we happen to know that there is a city of Bethlehem, which is in the northern tribe of Zevulun as well, right? If you go back to the book of Yehoshua, where it talks about all of the cities that they divided up, which I know seems like a long time ago, and maybe we don't exactly remember. We also didn't read all of the individual cities. That would have taken us a long time. But sometimes this can give you some interesting clues into what's happening later on. So at the very end, we read about how we have a judge from the tribe of Ephraim up north, one from Zevulun, again up north. But we have a tribe of we also have a city of Bethlehem, which is in Zevulun as well. If you look at Yehoshua, chapter 19, Pasuk Tetvav, we see that there's a city Bethlehem in the tribe of Zevulun. So it could stand to reason that all three of these judges all come from the northern part of Israel. Two of them from Zevulun, one of them from Ephraim. However, I think the commentaries and the traditional way that the rabbis explain this is that Ivtzan from Bethlehem is not from the Bethlehem in Zevulun. That would be strange that a small tribe like Zevulun would have two judges back to back, because the next one was Elon HaZevuloni, it was also from Zevulun. Two judges back to back, we don't typically see that. And therefore, Hazal tell us that Ivtzan mi Bethlehem, I believe it's Rashi over here actually mentions it. Yes, Rashi just makes one word. You can see I pulled it up on the screen. Rashi says, Ivtzan ze Boaz. And that's interesting. That's Hazal's way of explaining this, that the Bethlehem in this pasuk is Bethlehem Yehuda. It's Bethlehem from the tribe of Yehuda, as we see in Megillat Ruth, and that Ivtzan is Boaz, one of the heroes of Megillat Ruth, who is compassionate, who cares for Ruth, and who brings about the Davidic line, the line of David HaMelech that we're going to see later on in our next book, in the book of Shemuel. So I throw out the question to you, if we go with the rabbi's approach that Ivtzan is Boaz, and Boaz is this amazing figure, as we're going to read about it in Megillat Ruth, and we know that Megillat Ruth takes place in the time of the book of Judges. It opens with Vahi bimei shefot ha-shofetim. It was in the time of the judges being judged, which our rabbis explained as an ominous time, a time that people were not following their leaders, that they were questioning their leaders, that their leaders were of low moral fiber. So it kind of fits very nicely with the entire tone that we're experiencing now in our book of Judges. So the rabbis want to take Ivtzan, a no-name character here, connect him with Boaz, a very prominent character in the book of Megillat Ruth, try to link up the time frames together and say that Ivtzan is the same as Boaz. If that is true, and we go with that approach, what does it teach us here in our study of the book of Judges in chapter 12 in Perek Yud Bet? What could we glean from that?
That it wasn't all downhill, that there were some positive models within all the judges.
Excellent. Excellent. That's a very important part to bring out. Yes. I think that the rabbis are trying to say that amidst all of this turmoil and chaos, we should not lose sight of the fact, or have some ray of hope to the fact that there were individuals and certain leaders, maybe in smaller regions, that were taking place parallel to some of the judges, who were judging properly, who were trying to correct the moral standing of the people, who, despite the lack of kindness and compassion that people may have had, were trying to grow the people in that kind of way. It wasn't all darkness. There are these glimmers of hope and understanding that happen within the book of Judges. And the amazing thing is that if Ivtzan is Boaz, there's a glimmer of hope here in the book of Judges, which means within the book of Judges, we have already our starting point to the line of David HaMelech. So within all of this turmoil and chaos, we have a hint, albeit Shemuel kind of puts it under wraps. He does not expose it entirely, because that would be to divert the attention of the reader from Shemuel's goal. This goes back to the point I made to Esther before, that Esther so beautifully brought out, is that the text wants to emphasize the downward leadership spiral so that we can get to David. But along the way, Shemuel leaves us little clues, like the little droplets of Hansel and Gretel, to get us back to where we're going to eventually go, which is to the line of David HaMelech. He drops these little hints at us to say it's not all bad. Within the gloominess and darkness of the book of Shoftim, there are rays of hope. the start of the refu'ah, the healing, the redemption process has already begun behind the scenes of all of this chaos and turmoil. Yiftah is Boaz. He has all of his children. He's a compassionate leader. He is somebody who, as Megillat Ruth tells us, will begin the healing process of the Jewish people, getting us to the line of David HaMelech. And I think that's such a powerful lesson to end off on, because like I started the class, this all seems to just be gloom and doom. All of the terrible things that the Jewish people are doing, the civil wars, we're going to see Avodah Zarah, we're going to see promiscuity. Shimshon is going to give us a ray of hope, and then he's going to fail at the end of the day. And so we're just left time and again with this feeling of emptiness, this void in the book of Shofetim. And it's important from within that darkness to understand that the seeds of redemption are already getting planted behind the scenes. It's Yiftah who's already there, who's starting the Davidic line, who's a compassionate leader, who's getting us on the way to what eventually will be Shemuel, David, Shaul, and so on and so forth. So even when things look dark, even when they look like they're at their darkest point, we must never lose faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We must never lose faith in the fact that Hashem is going to preserve his people. We will always remain God's children, no matter what we do. And the seeds of redemption are always there, getting planted behind the scenes by God. This is like a Purim kind of idea, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to give us the ability to climb out of those depths. It's going to be hard. It's going to be an arduous road. We have to take the proper steps of leadership and behavior to get ourselves out of that. But Hashem is already orchestrating the plot to help us to climb out of this quicksand that is pulling us and dragging us down. And so while everything is gloom and doom, remember, Yiftah, Boaz, is also Boaz, and the seeds of redemption are starting to get planted. Hashem is never too far away from his people. He's always there watching, caring, and waiting for the time when we do enough to bring about the full and final redemption for ourselves. This should be a lesson for us that even when, we shouldn't even say we're living in dark times. There's a lot of craziness going on in the world, but we live in a time where we have Eretz Yisrael, we have a technologically, militarily, socially advanced nation that is a Jewish state, a Jewish nation. We're already at that glimmer of hope, but generations before us who didn't have that glimmer of hope, who struggled, even at their darkest times, already saw the seeds of redemption being planted. And we have to take that lesson from them as well, from what we're seeing here in the Navi, and continue to pray for the redemption, for the coming of our Mashiach, to know that Hashem is planting those seeds and they are not too far away from coming to fruition. Any questions or comments before we close our study for the day?
I have a question.
Sure.
Is the reason that the rabbis say that Ibsan is Boaz because he married his children to outsiders and he didn't have that fear of the outsider that Ruth was? Is that part of it? Or is it more like they just wanted to find somebody positive and connect him to Boaz?
It's an interesting question. I think the simplest reason why they connect him is the Bethlehem connection. You have a judge here who's from Bethlehem, who we don't know a lot about. And so the rabbis typically look at one part of Tanakh as sort of filling in the gaps from another part. So
Right.
if we know that there's a great man like Boaz, who's from Bethlehem, who has a crazy and amazing story, and we believe that Shemuel is connected to that story also, because don't forget, Shemuel wrote the book of Ruth as well. And so all of the pieces of the puzzle kind of locking in, it would be hard for them to imagine that Boaz is not hinted to somewhere in the book of Shofetim. So I think it's the Bethlehem connection. But I think you bring out a good point, which is to say that within this very, very short narrative, we have an interesting detail that maybe sheds light from a personality perspective, how Yiftah is Boaz, in that he embraced the fact that his daughters would marry into members of other tribes. He was trying to cross that line of divisiveness that Yiftah had set before him. He was trying to bring the people together to break down those barriers. And it's fitting that he should be the one to break down the barrier with an enemy nation such as Moab, to marry somebody like Ruth. So clearly he does not have that fear of the other. He's somebody who embraces the other and tries to bring unity to the Jewish people as a whole. So I think that that's a very powerful idea. What does become ironic with Chazal's approach that Boaz is Ivtzan is, according to this narrative, it means that Boaz has 60 children from multiple wives, right? That means that Boaz was not single; he was married already, right? We don't find that in the book of Ruth, right? In the book of Ruth, the impression that you seem to get is Boaz is a single man who has no heir and finds his way to Ruth. But if that Chazal's matching up is correct, that's not true at all. Boaz is somebody who, from his perspective, is well taken care of. He's got 60 children. He's fulfilled the responsibility of reproducing quite a bit. He's somebody who's a gibor hayil. He's a very strong person, means he has a lot of children. He has a lot of wealth. Boaz has no reason. He has no reason to pursue Ruth. And that's an interesting thing. So if you lock this in, there's really no reason that Boaz should be chasing someone like Ruth, other than the fact that he wants to do kindness with her. Boaz is married. He has multiple wives. He's got a lot of children. He's got wealth. He's a judge. He's a prominent individual. He has everything to lose in pursuing Ruth and almost nothing to gain, at least at face value, in pursuing Ruth. And yet he puts all of that aside simply for the notion that this is a woman who's in need, who needs kindness. I'm an heir. I can do it, and I will do it. And that type of kindness, not taking yourself into consideration, complete selflessness on the part of Boaz, is what brings about the Davidic line. It's the antithesis. It's the antidote for everything we're experiencing here. Everything we're reading about in Shofetim is about pride, is about gava, is about me, is about my legacy and my pride. And Ivtzan, who Boaz, is the complete opposite of that. He's the antithesis of that, and why he's able to bring about the eventual redemption with David HaMelech. So I appreciate that point that you brought out, Liz, about the connections here and some of the hinted details that the rabbis definitely, I think, picked up on. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we conclude our study for today. We're done with chapter 12. Be'ezrat Hashem. Next week, we're going to dive right into the narratives of Shimshon, which is a fascinating story, 4 chapters. And we'll begin that Be'ezrat Hashem next week. Enjoy, everyone. Take care.
And I'm muted.
Thank you, Rabbi.